Okay, hello and welcome to this episode of the Home and Energy Chats. My name is Heather Chandler and I am the owner and publisher of the Green and Healthy Maine Homes magazines. And every episode we chat with industry experts to learn about building healthy, efficient, and sustainable homes. I am very excited to have three very special guests with us today to talk about creative ways to reinvest your property with an ADU, that's an accessory dwelling unit. They are all leading thinkers on ADUs in Maine and beyond. We are so lucky to have them all with us today. Depth of knowledge both about the ADUs in general, also Maine's ADU law. So definitely queue up your questions if you have them. We did offer this workshop at our recent Green Home and Energy show in April, and it was one of the most highly attended workshops there. So I think you are in for a treat. I would like to start by saying a very special thank you to our season sponsor, Royal River Heat Pumps, a locally owned and operated company that is nationally recognized for heat pump excellence and is 100% committed to the highest standards of quality installation, service practices, and customer satisfaction. You can learn more about them online at royalriverheatpumps.com. And now a little bit about us. Green and Healthy Maine Homes is dedicated to inspiring healthy, efficient, and future-ready Maine homes. In addition to these chats, we also publish the Green and Healthy Maine magazine. We produce the Green Home and Energy show, as I mentioned, every year in April. And you can learn about all of this and more on our website, greenmainehomes.com. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Chris Lee is head of design and development at Backyard ADUs, a company that is focused on making it easier for people to build small homes, both in backyards and on standalone plots. He's been heavily focused on the zoning hurdles to create more affordable building lots, smaller dwellings, and as a result of the times, trying to identify ways to reduce the cost of construction and above all, make new construction available to everyone. He lives in Brunswick with his wife, dog, and daughter. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Parlin Meyer, who is a regular on the Home and Energy Chat. So thanks for being with us again, Parlin. Parlin is the managing principal of BrightBuilt Home, which is a design firm in Portland, Maine, that engages with offsite construction manufacturers who build modified and custom versions of their high-performance home designs. And prior to that, after 10 years at sea as a licensed captain and deck officer, Parlin began a second career in the early 2000s by pursuing architecture and development master's degrees from the University of Maryland, and today is deeply invested in advancing awareness and production of high performance and net zero homes to improve upon the environmental impact of the built environment. So welcome back, Parlin.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
And last but not least, Julien. This is Julien's first time joining us on the Home and Energy Chat. So welcome. Julien is the architecture design studio leader at Knickerbocker Group and a licensed architect in Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. He leads some of Knickerbocker's most innovative award-winning projects, including their sustainable prefab pods. He is especially passionate about custom homes and construction that prioritizes health, performance, and environmental responsibility. And his work has earned him multiple honors from AIA Maine, and he was also recognized as one of the 5 under 40 by New England Homes for his leadership in sustainable residential design and innovation in prefabrication. So welcome, Julien.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Happy to have all of you with us today. And a reminder that if you do have questions, we did get many questions through the registration process, but if you have additional questions, please feel free to add them at the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to get to them. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to kick us off.
All right. Thank you very much, Heather, and thanks for the invite. I'm excited to be here and kind of talk about ADUs and again, because as you said, it was a really good session in person. About a month ago, 2 months ago. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the realities of getting an ADU built. And as I'm doing so, I'm going to kind of draw from the experience that we picked up over the last 5 years and what we find building an ADU a week right now in Maine and Massachusetts. And it really comes down to infrastructure and site work. Next slide. So I'm going to talk and try to position these as roadblocks and tips. And really the key tip kind of starting this off is when you're going to do an ADU, you can almost always build one now. In Massachusetts, in New Hampshire, in Maine, all of the ropes have been dropped as far as the zoning goes. So you can pretty much do it. But you still need to verify the feasibility of the project. And especially as it relates to the budget. And there's a handful of key things that drive the underlying budgets of an ADU to make it too expensive or affordable for somebody. And generally speaking, when you're doing that process of doing feasibility, a general order, you can talk to the town for free. You should do that right up front and get some insights on whether or not you can build where you want to build. You can do a survey at some point in the process, but probably not first. At some point, you're going to hire an architect, but that's also probably not first. And then eventually you're going to talk to a builder. But all of these people are going to come in and I'm going to talk through exactly when and what they can help out with. Next. So through the years, and to kind of highlight what some of these things are to kind of start with cautionary tales. On the right side are some pictures and some descriptions of ADUs we've recently built, kind of showing the extent of the work that could happen. So one thing is conservation in Massachusetts is a really difficult thing, and it can be very unpredictable. In Maine, it's not so bad. It's fairly straightforward. But the picture on the top left is a picture of a supervised installation of erosion control on a suburban landscaped property in Lexington. On this project, we ended up spending almost $25,000 on professional plans and soil testing, and an additional $100,000 on site work to make sure that all water was discharged subsurface and would have no chance of getting to nearby wetlands. Another one to keep your ear out for. This is a Maine problem, specifically in a handful of towns near Portland, but sprinklers and fire safety. They can get expensive in a hurry. And the picture on the top right, that's a picture of a mess made by upgrading a water line in order to just supply the sprinkler system on a 450 square foot ADU. So it was a huge amount of additional scope, huge amount of additional disruption, and it did add some cost. In the bottom left is a picture of a hole that is going to be backfilled with sand and leaching equipment to accommodate one additional bedroom worth of septic discharge. It's not a good reference point, but that hole is almost 6 feet deep, 40 feet long, 15 feet wide. And that's to accommodate one additional bedroom from a septic capacity standpoint. Just try to imagine how many times you'd have to flush the toilet to fill that with water. It's pretty incredible. And that's a Massachusetts problem for the most part. In Maine, luckily, septic's still pretty easy. You can get a design, and it very rarely ends up like that. It's a Title V issue and regulatory piece in Massachusetts. And I always joke, Maine is not covered in failing septic systems, and all the people from Massachusetts still come here on vacation. So our septic can't be too underregulated. And then next one, sewer. This is a picture of trying to get sewer out. Just again, a lot of site work. So next. So this is actually going to be the 3 deal breakers, and I kind of position this. We're just going to talk very quickly about evaluating your utilities. kind of what we just looked at, some of the things that can go wrong or get complicated in a hurry. And these are the three things where you should be looking at before you really get a surveyor involved, an architect involved, or any of these paid professionals. So next. So the first utility, you need water. You need water to drink, you need water to flush the toilets, and you need water to get an occupancy permit. So this is from a planning complexity, we'd call this, like, on a scale of low, medium, high, this is going to be a medium complexity item. To figure this out, you're going to need a well driller or DPW involved, depending on whether you're private or public water. You're going to need an excavator involved, because you're going to have to get that water from point A to your ADU. And then you're probably going to need a plumber involved to comment on any a meter riser installation or a pressure tank or connecting to an existing basement. So those three are definitely involved. And then you may need an additional water filtration expert to come in there and comment on whether or not you can fit and need hard water or any hazardous stuff. The potential budget impact of this, up to 25,000. And that would be like a worst case scenario where you're drilling a well and you're doing like an arsenic or a radon system to take water out. New water services are usually closer to 10,000. Next. So when you're actually evaluating your water surface and talking to these people, you kind of divide it into public or private to figure out what you're going to be looking for. Public is really pretty easy. You're just looking at what is the diameter and material of your service pipe, and that's generally located in your basement. And most of the time, I think 9 out of 10 cases when we're evaluating, it's going to work just fine. And that's the piece that's expensive, is replacing that line. The next one is the meter size, also known as matter size, if you don't know how to type appropriately. And that was my bad. But it's the meter size. So that's the thing that's could potentially be a bottleneck. Most single family homes have a 5/8 meter in them. If you're going to add an ADU with an extra bedroom and extra bathroom, you're probably going to want to upgrade that to a 3/4 inch to make sure you don't have any pressure issues. And then the final one is distance to public connection. You generally need to worry about this if your house or ADU is going to be more than 100 feet from where you're connecting to the water, to the source of the water. And what happens is pressure drops. Wells, you're looking for refill rate, pump size, and water quality. And of those three, the refill rate's the one that can drive the cost. And that's basically saying, like, how quickly does your well fill back up with water after you draw it down? And that's going to determine if it's going to be able to service the ADU or if you have to drill a new well or do a holding tank. The pump size and water quality have solutions that can be prescribed and fixed at a reasonable price. Next. All right, septic and sewer. So this is a planning complexity high, primarily because of all of the people involved in Maine. Generally, Maine, this can get figured out pretty easily. In Mass, it's extremely difficult. The professionals needed, and this is you're gonna need a septic engineer. In Maine, that's often called a site evaluator. You're gonna need a builder, because they're gonna need to comment on where the system's gonna be relative to the house, so you can get gravity drainage. You're gonna need an excavator because they're the one gonna be pricing the system. And in Massachusetts, you're actually gonna need a town official. And that town official is going to oversee the soil testing and the work that gets done. So it's an extra layer of review. And then you may also need a civil engineer, depending on the municipality, and you may also need a surveyor, depending on proximity to property lines, because there's setbacks related to leach fields and septic tanks. And budget impact, could be a big one. In Maine, the average cost of a new 2-bedroom septic is usually 15 to 17,000, so it's not terrible. In Massachusetts, it generally starts at 20 and can get up to 40 or more in a hurry when you start adding in new nitrogen reduction things that are often required now by their Title V. In Maine, we don't have a lot of Title V nitrogen reduction requirements yet, unless you're in like the Saco River corridor, or if you're in a protected resource zone. Next. So the evaluation of your septic service, again, we're going to break this into septic and public. If you have septic sizes are all based on bedroom count. So the number of bedrooms dictates how big your septic needs to be. Whether or not low nitrogen requirements are going to be needed, that's going to be the thing that blows up your budget. Grades, water, and effluent goes downhill. So you might need a pump, and that's a big price driver. And then percolation and groundwater. That's going to determine whether or not you have one of those mounded systems or not, and that's a big driver of cost. Public is a hell of a lot easier. You're just concerned with flowing downhill with grade, the condition of your sewer pipe, and if there's any weird DPW requirements, which are becoming a fad in a lot of bougie towns, where they all of a sudden have opinion on how to run your lines outside. All right, next. All right, the last utility is power. This is the easiest one. Planning complexity low. So you need the professionals that are involved in this. It's going to be the utility company. They're going to have the final say on how you get power from the street to your ADU. It's their jurisdiction. And then you're going to need an electrician to comment and help you figure out whether or not you can connect to your existing house, and whether or not and how to do your meter setup. And then you might need an excavator if you're going to do underground power. And oftentimes there's some component of underground, but the excavator scope is very simple. And oftentimes the electrician may be able to hand wave what it would cost to trench. Potential budget impact up to 20 grand. That's going to be a really long underground service, more than 150 feet. More often than not, the electrical connections for a new service is less than 5,000. So this is the easy one to deal with. Next.
Chris, before we go on, can you talk to the variety in different municipalities for whether they require to go to the street or whether they allow you to attach to an existing house if you're doing a detached ADU?
So it's different for all three of the utilities, and it's different in each town. Sewer is generally dictated by the Department of Public Works' policies, and they are most of them do not have an opinion on it. And then they start to get opinions after the first detached ADUs get built. And they tend to draw from some of the towns that have silly, complicated rules that cost a lot of money. Portland is an example where you can't connect within your existing house's basement, but you can connect in the front yard, but they don't require a new street connection. So that can create some complications and get expensive if your house is right in the way of getting to the street or to the front yard. There's not a lot of requirements to have separate sewer connections. We don't see that very often. And in Massachusetts, part of the Affordable Homes Act outlaws it. You can't actually have separate, municipal entities cannot require separate utility connections for ADUs. And that was something that we actually lobbied when they were doing the rulemaking, because it was costing so much. Unfortunately, if Maine were to do something similar like that, there's a lot of entities that are not part of the municipality that do sewer and water in Maine, which is different in Mass. But water, you can usually connect in the basement and not have to go to the street. But I think if you're being asked to do a new street connection for any of this, it's definitely worth poking at it. Don't just accept that, because it's a very expensive requirement. And if you don't need it, you want to avoid digging up blacktop.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
So evaluating your electric service. So you or your electrician, you're basically looking at how big is your current service, how many amps is coming in, and a house is usually 100 amps or 200 amps. To do an ADU, you're probably going to want to have the 200 amp service at a minimum. The current service utilization, basically like how much power is being used at dinner time. And that's a function of, do you have heat pump heating? Do you have a hot tub, a pool, all of the things that are drawing on that, and you're trying to make sure there's enough left over to add another, hopefully all electric house in your backyard or attached to your house. Distance to public connection point, just like with water, there is basically friction in an electrical line, and the longer it gets, the harder it is to push electricity. So that could be a point of additional cost. And then the ADU power needs. What are you building? Are you building something all electric? Are you going to have a propane tank out there? Are you going to be really weird and put an oil tank in your ADU? But the power needs is going to help dictate this as well. Next. And then kind of turning back to something semi-positive. So ADUs are still the cheapest thing to build, despite all of those potential areas of additional cost. ADUs, like a attached ADU, if you were trying to convert a garage or do something small, you could probably figure out how to get that done for 150,000. With some of those projects getting to be as much as 300. Detached, if you really try hard, you might be able to find a way to get it done for 200,000 if you're hiring everything out. And we see them go as high as 400 and even 500. But I think on average, a new ADU is running between 250 and 350, fully detached, just building a small house in a backyard. New single family homes are a lot more than that these days. A starter home, you'll struggle to find a new built starter home for less than 350. And in reality, I think in the Portland area after land, they're probably going to be starting at 4 to 5. And the new apartment buildings are wildly expensive. In Massachusetts, the average cost of a new 1-bedroom apartment in a building is 600,000 per unit. And a lot of the pro formas in Maine for new affordable housing are between 300,000 and 400,000 a unit. So it's wildly expensive, and somehow detached ADUs are still cheaper. And part of that is easier utilities. They've got much lower soft costs. The architectural concerns are a lot lower. They get permitted quickly. But we should be building more of them. They're the cheapest thing to build right now. And we fully believe that with what we've seen. And I will soften that. They're still not that cheap. These are big numbers. And it's a pandemic era inflation problem that caused this. Next. And then quickly, I'm going to briefly go over these because I think I'm at time here for my portion, but some new programs to kind of keep in the back of your ADUs. If you're a municipal listener or from the state and you're thinking about trying to fund ADUs to help homeowners do affordable housing with them, we are big proponents of trust funds. Do not give away grant money. Generally, ADUs don't need grants. They're a trust fund, a low interest rate loan that replenishes the state coffers and it makes the money go farther is going to spur development of these. Employer partnerships, there's a huge opportunity here to pull employers in to help pay for these and build them for their employees as transitional housing. This would be huge on the mid-coast for employers like Penn Bay, the hospital and other spots. And then finally, this is a really neat one. I haven't seen it done yet, but there's an opportunity. You might not need to subdivide in order to sell an ADU. You could do a condoization, like you might not need frontage and subdivide your land. So there's an opportunity to just sell the rights for someone else to build the ADU and take a check. So if you don't have a subdividable lot, maybe you actually do. And this is probably something that could work in Portland under their zoning. So if you're in Portland and you're listening and want to give this a try, there might be a path to get it done. And with that, I'll hand it off. I think Julien or Heather, back to Heather.
Parlin's actually up next, so let's hand it over to Parlin, who's going to talk a little bit more about zoning and financing.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. Obviously, a lot of moving parts, even with these small homes, but all of this is really great information and will help hopefully inform folks as they dig into this, both figuratively and literally. So I'm going to kick off by starting with talking about zoning. So we can go to the next slide. This is essentially just some quick steps, or orienting folks to some quick steps on the things that you want to nail down in order to reinforce the fact that you're going to be able to build an ADU on your property. Depending on where you're building, what state you're in, obviously there are new laws that have recently been passed that honor or recognize the need to be able to do ADUs more or less by right, but you're still going to have local municipalities doing potential additional considerations or requirements that you'll want to know about before you get too far into the process. So I've laid this out in essentially 4 steps, and I'm going to walk through each of these steps, but the first step is identifying which zone your property is in, and then doing some research on ordinances for that zone, researching the actual ADU permissions for the town, and then just knowing some of the specifics about your lot, which circles back to what Chris was digging into with regard to the utilities. So next slide, we'll start with identifying the zone. So I don't know if those of you who are on the webinar right now or listening at a later date have had the pleasure of digging into zoning maps or searching for a zoning map with your town, but it can be quite a study in exploration or adventure. It's always an interesting process because there isn't a specific way that it's done with every single town. So every town organizes their zoning a little bit differently. They organize their naming conventions differently, and they actually even organize where to find the information differently. But first step is to find your town's zoning map. Generally speaking, these days, all towns have their own websites, and you're going to be able to go in and search either for the Department of Planning or zoning. You know, there's various departments that might govern this. But honestly, the way that I find the easiest to find this is I'll put in the name of the town and just write, for example, Portland zoning map. And Google or the search engines will generally get you to close to the right destination. So you find this zoning map, and it'll look generally like something like this on this slide. And with it, it will have a legend identifying what all of the color code or letter codes indicate. So the other thing that's really fun about zoning maps is it looks generally exactly like this, where you'll have an outline of the town, you'll have the various bodies of water potentially. Those are conveniently named, but what isn't named is any of the streets. So you have to do a little bit of sleuthing and a little bit of cross comparison with a map to really nail down where you might be. It can become trickier if you're close to a border between 2 different zones. But you'll want to kind of play around, zoom in, identify which zone your property lands in. And so in this case, for example, let's say you land in the yellow zone. You look at the legend and identify, okay, that's the residential district. All right. And then also, just as a side note, you'll want to make sure, particularly if you're in areas that are close to water, bodies of water, you'll want to look for overlay districts. If you look at the bottom of this legend, you can see there's some additional notation on the zoning map to illuminate where there might be a watershed protection overlay district, or in one specific case in this town, Bigelow Laboratory Contract Zone. So some specifics just to be aware of, and some things to watch out for as you're nailing down your zone. Probably for most people that are looking with a single family home, you're likely to be in a residential zone of some sort. Could be a historic zone, could be a coastal residential zone. You know, there certainly can still be some nuance, but chances are you're in pretty good shape to be able to put an ADU in. So then we go to the next slide. And you then cross-reference the zone that you're in with the permitted uses of that zone. So this also becomes an exercise in sleuthing, because you have to be able to decipher the different letter codes that are used by the town, not only the codes that identify the zone, which you can see at the top here, where we're seeing those same abbreviations and letter codes that identify the individual zones, but also the letter codes that in this case correspond to the permitted uses. So it's really, you know, all of the information will be there with the town, but you're trying to identify, you know, is this a place where I can actually put an ADU in, or what are the permitted zone uses in this case? And then with that, you're also looking into the specific restrictions for the zone. So in this case, residential, you want to find what are the lot setbacks in my zone? Are they 20 feet on the side? Are they 6 feet on the side? Are they 30 feet at the front? Are they 15 feet at the front? So those constraints, particularly if you're on a smaller infill lot in a urban or semi-urban environment, you'll want to pay some close attention to what those setbacks are, to know what the actual buildable footprint is that you can build on with your accessory dwelling. Also important to note, and this of course should be something that's in your paperwork with the property itself, but whether there are any easements on the property, that could be anything from a neighbor who has a driveway that goes through the lot, which is obviously pretty straightforward and likely exists. It could be a paper road. It could be power, utility easements. So just pay close attention to make sure you're not going to be trying to encroach on any of those with the construction of a new ADU. And then of course, if there are any special conditions specific to the zone. Next slide. So more specifically getting into the permissions with regard to ADUs, one way in which I recommend doing this is you're going into now the actual zoning ordinance for the town. And the way that I recommend digging into this is using the search term accessory. Different towns, I think more and more people are coming to use the term ADU, and that's becoming more common in the vernacular. But over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, there's been various terminology that's been employed by different towns. Granny flats, accessory dwellings, accessory units, accessory apartments, so accessory seems to be the one term that's been a little bit more consistent throughout. So that's what I've found to be a useful search term to start to bring up what is the accessory requirements in this town. By searching that, you should be able to identify then what the unit size minimum and maximum is for your zone and for the town, and what the lot size itself minimum and maximum is. Certain towns have, you can't do an ADU on a lot size smaller than 16,000 square feet, for example. So it's important to tease that out a little bit to ensure, again, as part of your own due diligence and finding out whether this is feasible or not. There also sometimes there are ownership restrictions in some towns whereby they don't want people building ADUs on homes that are second homes or are already rental properties. So again, there's constantly evolving regulatory aspects to this and constantly evolving laws around a lot of these, but these are just things to continue to be aware of as you're doing your research. And then of course, the utilities requirements, which Chris spoke to in depth already. Next slide. So then finally, of course, again, to speak to what Chris went over, the lot specifically, what are some of the requirements of the lot? What's your capacity of your water? What's your capacity of your sewer? Are there impact fees if you're tying into existing municipal systems? How do you get to the site where you're trying to build? Can you get back to that site? Or what does that delivery look like? And what sort of reinforcement or, gravel or driveway or what might you need to put in order to get back to where your ADU is going? And then the distribution panel size in this case is in reference to the electrical. So Chris spoke to that as well. Next slide. All right, so I just wanted to, as by way of further familiarizing what you might find when you start to do some of this research, I wanted to give a couple quick examples of town requirements right now. So next slide. This is the town of Kennebunk. They allow 1 ADU on lots with 1 single family home. It has to be accessory to an owner occupied single family home, or it can be vice versa. So the owner can occupy the ADU and rent their primary residence. One of the 2 structures must be that primary residence. So you must be living there at least 6 months of the year. You have to demonstrate to the town that you're complying with the wastewater requirements. You can only rent one, can't rent both. And interestingly, and this makes some sense at first blush, it feels a little strange, but permitting for the ADU itself does not actually transfer with the sale of the property. What that means is that the person who purchased, if the whole property was to go up for sale, had an ADU on it that was permitted by the seller, the buyer would simply need to reapply with the town for that ADU. And essentially that's to demonstrate compliance with those other owner-occupant based requirements, that you're demonstrating that you are going to be living there 6 months of the year. One of the two is your primary residence, et cetera. Next slide. In the town of Boothbay, ADUs are permitted in all zones. It just needs to be reviewed by the code enforcement officer of the town. One ADU is permitted on lots with 1 or 2 single-family homes. However, there's an asterisk there whereby that's not the case in the shoreland zone. So that's where that overlay piece can come into play, depending on where you're located. This is another interesting caveat, which is that the number of occupants in the ADU is limited to 2 adults, which I thought was interesting. Also that they must be accessory to an owner-occupied single-family home, so similar to what we saw in Kennybunk. Here's one where there's a cap on the amount of square footage. That's not uncommon. A lot of towns will cap the ADU size at either a specific number as ordained by the town or a specific percentage of the primary home already on the property. And in this case, there is a lot minimum for if you're on municipal sewer versus if you're on a septic system. So certain lot size constraints here as well. Next slide. And then finally in Harpswell, again, permitted in all zones, just needs review by the code enforcement officer. Again, accessory to the owner occupied property and must be, interestingly, this also, the ADU must be the primary residence of the ADU occupant. So their intent is to have ADUs there for longer term housing. Next slide. So this digs in a little bit to the financing of ADUs. Certainly there are other potential avenues right now that Chris spoke to a bit in terms of incentive programs or locally run trust funds or kind of low interest loan programs. So I'm just touching on kind of the individual home buyer personal financing angles here. So I'm not speaking to some of those bigger picture options, but let's go to the next slide. So the way that we most frequently see individuals financing these ADUs is with a HELOC, where they're borrowing against the equity of their existing property to get cash to put towards the construction and costs of putting an ADU on their property. Occasionally, it can also be financed with a second mortgage. And then, of course, yes, some of those incentive programs that I spoke to. I will say that obviously a lot of those incentive programs don't necessarily cover the cost in whole. They may contribute a small percentage to help offset some of the costs, but unless it's a trust fund with a low interest loan, those incentive programs are usually just very, very partial in terms of what they contribute to the overall cost. And then, of course, there's cash. And then the don't forget here is in reference to some of those considerations around what might impact the costs with your ADU approach. So let's say, for example, you really want to put in a 2-bedroom ADU, you may find that that's going to significantly inflate your infrastructural costs, and you'll be compelled, therefore, to stick with a 1-bedroom. But you're going to want to know that at the outset, and you're going to want to know also what level of financing you have to work with or funding you have to work with. Next slide. So one recommendation that we have is that you work with local lenders. We find that local lenders, local mortgage brokers generally are more creative with what they can pull together. They're going to be more collaborative and flexible. They'll generally be able to provide more competitive interest rates. And some, not all, but some actually will take into account projected rental income if that's going to be factored into the longer term amortization payments on the financing. Yep, just a tip to, as speaking again to what Chris was speaking to, get familiar with what incentive programs there are out there. Are there federal programs? Are there state programs? Are there even programs in your town? Chris has mentioned in other presentations that the city of Rockland is looking at doing something and putting together trust funds. So it's possible that your local town has some regulation on the books or that they're trying to pass that will provide a funding opportunity for you to pursue. And then if you're interested in renting the unit, you don't have a family member or somebody in mind, there are some local platforms and organizations also that might be able to provide that kind of conduit to that renter population. Next slide. And that's it for me. So I'll be handing it over to Julien.
Before we jump to Julien, I do have a quick question for you, Parlin. First of all, thank you so much. That was very helpful. My understanding of the Maine law that passed in 2023 was that all single-family lots in Maine were required to allow an ADU on them, and that they set minimum square footage, and that towns could go more. No, towns could get less restrictive, but not more restrictive. But in looking at your presentation, it sounds like that's not true in some cases. Can you clarify that?
I mean, I don't know that it's not true by any of the criteria from those towns. It's all of the criteria that are spelled out by the town there aren't explicitly outlawing ADUs. They are permitting ADUs with those nuanced caveats. So, and if the square footage differences are evident there, then it could be that that's been updated with a couple of those towns. But to my knowledge, there's nothing in there that suggests an ADU can't be built.
So they're allowed on all single family lots. It's just that there are these other restrictions to keep in mind.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yes.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
All right, so let's turn it over to Julien, who is going to get into some of the details. And I think you're going to talk a little bit more about the law too. So let's take it away, Julien.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Parlin, for the segue, and for Chris for the introduction to the presentation. So yeah, I'm Julien Jalbert with Knickerbocker Group. I'm going to be talking about ADU delivery methods today. My presentation will be a little bit more brief than my predecessors, so hopefully that will open up more time for questions at the end. But so I'll be touching on kind of different opportunities and how to get ADUs on your property. There's, attached versus detached. We're talking new construction versus renovation, and then site built versus prefabricated ADUs. So next slide. So attached versus detached. So, historically, a lot of municipalities have been more inclined to, ensure that you have an attached ADU, which means you're basically taking either a portion of your home that already exists and converting it into an accessory dwelling unit, or potentially adding an addition on the back or the side or what have you to basically enlarge your home slightly to get that additional space for the ADU. As we've already heard today, with that scenario, generally speaking, you're kind of locked in with certain square footages you can't exceed or be less than. And again, it's often a percentage of the size of the primary house that the ADU services. But now more than ever, we're seeing more opportunity for detached ADUs, which is exciting. Those have been pretty big on the West Coast for many years now, where you can literally have a small little house just kind of right in the backyard next to a larger home. And those are great because those can provide a little bit more, privacy for the renter or person living in the ADU. It gives a little bit more of a buffer, which is nice as well. And again, it all kind of boils down to ultimately zoning requirements and what the town will or will not allow. From my experience, I think, and maybe Parlin and Chris, you can speak to this too. I think some towns are still restrictive and may not allow a fully detached ADU, where they only allow attached, is my knowledge. And it kind of depends on the town, and generally the kind of density that you're looking at. And typically, as you've already heard, most ADUs need to either be occupied by the owner of the the home. They can either live in the ADU and rent the house, or vice versa. And short-term rentals are often frowned upon in ADUs. They don't want Airbnbs and having corporations basically buying houses and just renting both the house and the ADU for exorbitant amounts of money for short periods of time. And also, I already mentioned that the percentage of square footage is often something to keep in mind when you're building an ADU. And also ADUs need to also adhere to the same general setback requirements of the home. So you have your side yard, front yard, rear yard setbacks. I know in other parts of the country, like Los Angeles, and Seattle, where ADUs have been big for a while, the zoning has become a little less stringent, where they've reduced like side yard and rear yard setbacks, where your ADU can be 4 feet from the fence versus 10 or 15 feet, which allows for, I think, a more, decent way to situate, say, a detached ADU, so it's not right up against the house. So hopeful that, as ADUs continue to catch on in Maine and beyond, the zoning will continue to become more lenient in that way to allow for a little bit more breathing room for ADUs on, smaller parcels and infill lots like in, Portland and Westbrook and those kind of areas. So next slide. So new construction versus renovation. If it's an addition to a home, you could, in theory, do that as new construction, like kind of adding on. You could also, renovate the house. And there's obviously new construction option with something like prefabrication. So on the left photo is one of Knickerbocker's prefab pods being delivered and set at our Booth Bay campus. And that was built off-site in our modular facility. And I know that both Chris and Parlin also dabble in the kind of modular world with their ADUs as well to, do as much work off-site to, help keep costs low and schedules fast. So there's a lot of benefits to new construction. Renovation, you can often find the best bang for your buck with the renovation, especially if you are, seeing a space in your home that's maybe underutilized. For example, this photo on the right is my house in South Portland. I bought my house in 2017 and had what was a 1-car garage attached to the side of my house. I live in the 1943 Cape. Someone had over the years put like an addition onto the garage to make it somewhat of an ADU, which was not to code and had a lot of issues. So I ended up gutting and renovating the whole thing for the most part myself. And I converted that into an ADU, which I now rent, and it pays for my mortgage, which is pretty great. So that's amazing. And again, it's kind of thinking outside the box as far as if you want to say renovate part of your home to become an ADU, and just, what spaces might you have that could afford that opportunity? That, garage that's just full of stuff that you don't put cars in and just is, collecting clutter, that could be converted into an ADU. A segment of your basement that's just, again, like underutilized, that could, be renovated, and you can maybe provide an additional, entrance via an outdoor stair or something like that to get down there, an attic space, so just thinking about any areas of your house that, maybe not used to their full potential currently, that you could consider converting into an ADU to, offset your day-to-day, costs and your mortgage and that sort of thing. I wanted to touch a bit more on new construction as well. So there are more added costs, with like a new construction detached, for example, which I think both Chris and Parlin have touched on somewhat, with the needing to add additional utilities. You're going to bring in potentially, new sewer, new power, new water, etc. So there can be some, pretty decent costs to get those different infrastructure pieces to the ADU. So if you can find a way to get it under the same roof that you occupy, in a lot of cases, those utilities are already there. You're just kind of like, renovating to rework what's existing. I guess one of the benefits, as I mentioned before, new construction, you could potentially provide more privacy for the ADU, or you could, put plantings in between the two units to provide screening, where in essence, you have almost just 2 single-family homes just sharing a lot with privacy, which is nice. Let's go to the next slide, please. So yeah, I've already kind of touched on this briefly, but this idea of site built versus prefab, there are benefits to both. Site built often, lets you be a little more nimble as far as, renovation. Could you do a prefab renovation addition? You can get creative and maybe do a, some sort of prefab ADU that connects, some municipalities that do require connection of ADU to house. I have an example of a custom home I'm working on right now at Knickerbocker, where one of our clients, also bought one of our 2-bed, 1-bath, we call them pods, as a guest house. And we're actually attaching it via a pergola to the primary house to then meet the zoning requirements of needing to kind of connect house and ADU to basically be a, one residence. So there's some, ways working through zoning to basically attach, a new construction to a, either existing house or a somewhat separate structure. And again, the idea of site built, the photos on the left there, you can see that's kind of that creative thinking outside the box of existing spaces you may have. That was a, garage that one day someone decided to turn into an apartment, and they have a nice space in their backyard that's taking advantage of what was otherwise pretty much underutilized space. And again, site built costs are typically lower, which is obviously a perk. For prefab, you know, the delivery is super fast generally in comparison to, you know, most things site built. I think I'm sure Chris and Parlin can speak to timeframes, but you know, generally with our prefabs, we've had all of our clients in their homes moved in, turnkey, ready to go in 6 months or less. So that's in essence a new construction home starting from site work to move in 6 months or less, which is very rapid, which is you know, a great opportunity for a lot of folks. And then yeah, the prefab unit, as I mentioned before, you know, it often requires those additional utility coordination and a little bit more upfront legwork and added cost to, you know, get that you know, prefab if it's detached anyway for the property. So next slide, I believe that might be it for my segment. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julien. So we have a few minutes to jump into Q&A, and we did receive several questions during the registration process. I think some of these have already been touched on, so I'll sort of zoom in on the ones that we haven't yet. Katrina is interested in building a 2-bedroom, 1-bath ADU, and she's wondering if you have any recommendations on minimum square footage that she might consider as comfortable for a long-term rental. Like when you're talking about a 2-bedroom, is there sort of a recommended minimum?
Yeah, I would say anywhere from like the 800 and 900 square foot range gives you still a decent amount of comfort and living space while keeping it relatively compact. And there are different building forms and footprints that can take that form, that can take that square footage. So you could go a hair lower than 800 and still get a 2-bedroom unit. And in some ways still very comfortable 2-bedroom unit, depending on how you lay it out, but that'd be my recommendation. See what Chris and say.
I was just saying, I think some municipalities too, from what I've seen in Maine anyway, their cap tends to be right at around 800, where they say they don't want it any bigger than that. So that's kind of a sweet spot that we found that we targeted with our units, you know, just to kind of meet most zoning requirements and kind of pass the straight face test. So
I was going to say 720 square feet. So I was under.
Nice.
We have a 720 square foot 2-bedroom floor plan on our website you could download. It's from our Square design platform, but it's 28 feet by 27.5 feet, and it's got 2 9-by-8 bedrooms, and a decent sized bathroom. It doesn't have a ton of storage, but often, which is a key thing for rentals often, but it's pretty comfortable. We built them a few times and it does not feel overly small.
Great, thank you. Mindy is asking about the value that having an ADU added to your property adds in the future if you want to sell your home. So does anyone have a sense of what type of value having an accessory dwelling unit brings to your property?
Yeah,
And you're nodding. So
yeah. Well, right. I mean, there's the monthly value of getting income, an income stream from the property itself. And then in terms of resale value, I've seen anywhere from 30 to 50% of additional value on the property itself. And Julien, you should chime in too with your.
Yeah. I mean, so I have an ADU on my property and I've watched the Zillow, you know, valuation just continue to climb as, you know, time goes by. And yeah, you're in essence, you know, if I sell and when I sell, maybe when I retire, who knows? I'll be selling in essence a 2-family home in a single-family neighborhood, which, you know, to, you know, tell a prospective buyer that you'll buy this house and you can day one have this income for rental to offset your mortgage. That's a huge, you know, perk for people to say, sure, my mortgage is X, but I get to deduct Y from that every month because of the rental. That's amazing. And depending on the market you're in, like South Portland, the rental market is insane. Like I've listed my apartment now several times, and the first day I get 100 hits. Like so, you know, the supply and demand of, you know, rentals in certain areas too are just like, it's a foolproof thing to do. So it's pretty amazing.
I'll be the outlier, unfortunately. I'll be a little bit contradictory here. They don't appraise for what you pay to build them. And that is a fact. So you will be underwater after you build it. That said, I will agree that there are a lot of people who want this and who want a property with a really nice acquainted ADUs for all kinds of reasons. So there's a big buyer market for it. But appraisal values are behind the cost of construction. And that's not something unique to ADUs. That's something unique to single family homes in general, because the cost of construction has just gone up so much. So if you're going to build an ADU, you should be very sure about the other reasons you're building it, not the increase in your property value, because you're not going to get it right out of the gate. You probably catch back up in 5 to 10 years. And it's also very, very dependent on what municipality you're in. If you're in Portland or South Portland or Scarborough, where we have really high sale prices, it's going to be closer to break even. If you're west of 95 or up north, you're going to be very underwater because the cost of construction is the same in those communities as it is near I-95 and around Portland. But the comps used to value houses are nowhere near the values locally. So be careful with the valuations. Don't build an ADU for that reason. Think about it for all of the other reasons that it should get built.
And also too, Chris, depends probably on attached versus detached. Like if you build basically a brand new little house in the backyard versus, not to toot my own horn, I did most of the work on my ADU except for like the electrical and the heat pumps. I spent 20 grand out of pocket and that was it. So it was
Yeah,
a
and you're
pretty
probably
low
ahead.
investment, to get an ADU, right? So if you want to roll up your sleeves and build it yourself, do it.
Oh, in that situation, 100%, you're gonna get that sweat equity, right? You're not gonna be paying a GC and a designer. You're gonna get the sweat equity. You're gonna earn every dollar of it. And it definitely depends on the form. The weird thing is with how appraisals are done on ADUs is the methodology hasn't quite caught up. So appraisers don't have the tools to value a second house in the backyard. They don't have the way to do that. So it doesn't appraise that way. And we haven't had enough of them basically change hands in order to provide lots of good examples for appraisers to use for comps. We've had 2 of our ADUs sell in the last 5 years. One was in North Berwick and one was in Whately, Massachusetts. And I don't know what they paid for their houses, but back of the envelope, I don't think they got all of their money out because they sold inside of that 5-year period, which again, going to like building a new single family house, it's a tough market with the cost of construction.
Important to keep in mind. Thanks for sharing that. A lot of these questions we have already answered. Joyce did ask, what are your forecasts for 10 years out? I'm not exactly sure what she's asking. Joyce, if you're here and you want to clarify what you mean there, we can certainly try to answer that one. There was a question about adapting existing structures into ADUs, and that's been pretty well answered. My understanding of the law, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the law in 2023 allowed ADUs to take several forms in Maine. So they could be attached, making use of attic, basement. They could be detached and new, or they could be detached and renovating an existing structure on your property. So a barn, a garage, that sort of thing. Is that your understanding of the law as well?
Yeah. Yep.
Nodding. And then last question here is Jean is asked, was someone going to say something? No. Okay. Jean was asking how to make ADUs net zero and what options there are for panelized construction in Maine and New England. So couldn't have served this up to a better panel of experts. I think all of you can speak to this. Parlin, you're showing up on my screen. So do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. Really, the way to make any structure net zero is to tie it in with renewable energy. So the most obvious and readily available form of renewable energy is solar. And in most cases, particularly if you're equipping the accessory dwelling with energy efficient systems. So air source heat pumps are typical for heating and cooling. Heat pump hot water heaters are common for domestic hot water. And then having some form of air exchange, because these higher performance structures are they have a better air transfer protection. Essentially, they're not super leaky like all of our older homes are. So you'll want a pre-filtered air system in them, but all of those systems really use electricity very, very efficiently. And so it doesn't require a ton of solar to get them to net zero. Solar installers abound in Maine, so there's no lack of them. And certainly having a solar installer come to your site and assess it and verify feasibility for solar access on your site or where you're planning to put your ADU, if you want to put solar directly on it, will be an important step. But there's also solar co-ops and off-site solar that's available to tap into as well. So getting to functional net zero or literal net zero is very, very easy in Maine, and very easy in particular with these smaller structures.
Thank
Yep.
you.
I would
Yeah.
concur, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise when you're starting to build. There's no reason to bring gas or oil into a small house. It's a waste of money. And a lot of times it's going to cost you more money to have a separate heating infrastructure than just doing a heat pump. And it's going to be less comfortable. So all over, it's going to be net negative. It's going to be very similar in cost. And don't let anyone tell you you can't heat and cool a house in northern Maine with a heat pump. If you're really nervous about it, add a wood stove as your backup. So
That's a great point to end on, and thank you for bringing that up. We've actually just exceeded our time, so forgive me for missing that. So I am going to wrap us up now, and thank you all again for joining us. Thank you for sharing your time today as panelists. And thanks again to our sponsor, Royal River Heat Pumps, and our webinar producer, Rain Rayner, who has been managing everything so beautifully behind the scenes. This is actually Rain's last webinar because she is leaving to go to grad school for landscape architecture this fall. So we will miss her, but she's done a really great job producing these webinars. This is our last session of our spring season. We do take the summer off, so we'll be resuming these in the fall. But if you want to catch up on past recordings, they're all on our website, greenmainhomes.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletter and socials and hear about all of the new programming that we get scheduled for the fall. So greenmainhomes.com